What happened immediately following the American Revolution? Did George Washington just walk off the battlefield and into the White House? Did Ben Franklin call down lightning, after all, he invented it, and out of the ground popped the Washington Monument? Was the Statue of Liberty erected in New York? Actually, none of those things happened. In fact, immediately following the American Revolution, there's a period known as the critical period, in which it's unclear whether or not this new experiment with democracy, with a republican form of government, was going to work. So let's talk about what happened. The American Revolution did not violently or radically change the entire political or social framework like we might see in other revolutions like France or Russia, but it did usher in important social changes, leading some to call the American Revolution more of an accelerated evolution rather than a true revolution. Let's take a look at some of the things that changed. On a religious standpoint, the Anglican Church is going to lose its influence in those states which had established churches, tax supported churches. Those are going to go away. We're going to see new religious freedom and tolerance in the state of Virginia, with the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom penned by Thomas Jefferson. Slavery, America's original sin, it's not really addressed after the American Revolution. The true hypocrisy of a war fought for all men to be created equal is not lived out in practice in the United States. However, there are some changes. Quakers are going to found the first anti-slavery society. Some northern states are going to abolish slavery, but for many of them, it's going to be a gradual process that's going to take years. There is an overall general feeling by many, including many slave owners, that slavery was evil, but the breakup of this country would be a greater equal, knowing that had slavery been addressed in, say, the Declaration of Independence, that is something that southern states could not have supported, and therefore it had to be taken out. For women, they are not going to be granted the equality that some of them had called for, but women are going to take on a new role known as Republican motherhood. This idea that if we're going to have a Republican form of government, one that is based upon civic virtue, then children need to be raised understanding those ideas and principles, and that women are the primary educators at that time, educating in the home. And so that women themselves need to be aware and have an understanding of the political principles on which the country was founded. And so, in an odd sort of way, it did open new opportunities for women to have a voice, however limited politically, because of the expectation that they would be able to educate their children in the concepts. After all, this country is called the United States of America, not the United Colonies. In 1776, all of the colonies began to draft their own constitutions because they were no longer colonies under the control of a king, but rather independent sovereign states. These constitutions recognized that they derive their power from the people rather than a king. Their constitutions were fundamental law, written law, meaning that they were the bedrock principles on which all other laws would be founded. And many of these state constitutions included bills of rights, many of them borrowed from the English Bill of Rights, which was something that people living at that time understood. State legislatures had most of the power. Remember, these are people who are weary of concentrated power in the hands of an individual like a king. So it makes sense that they wouldn't grant a lot of power to a governor. And capital cities are actually going to move west in many states. At this time, proximity meant power, and because the populations were moving westward in the states, the capitals moved closer to where those moving populations were. On the economic front, there's going to be some pretty major changes. In some cases, loyalists who fled the country after the war, who were wealthy and had land, that land was seized and divided up and sold off to help pay debts. Very small infant American manufacturing did do rather well during the war because they were not able to get anything from Britain. But after the war, as trade opens up again, they're going to suffer. Oh, and overwhelmingly, most Americans are not working in manufacturing. They're not any sort of artisan. This was a nation of farmers. All the states are in a lot of debt because they borrowed so much money to fight the war, and inflation is running rampant because oftentimes to pay those debts, money is being printed in all the states, different kinds of money, worthless money. And they can't raise any money in many cases to pay the debts because there's a general distaste for taxes. And state governments are going to have a tough time trying to tax their own people to pay their debts. But there was a government after the revolution was over. In fact, there was a government during the American Revolution, and it wasn't the government organized under the Constitution that we're familiar with today. It was the first government of this country organized under the Articles of Confederation, a document that was written in 1777 during the war, in part to signal to other countries who we wanted to, form relationships with, like the French, that hey, this is a legitimate country and this is the government of that country. It's ratified in 1781, which means it's not actually made official. And the reason being is land. Many of the colonies had a lot of land to the west, had claims to land to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. Virginia, New York, and some of the others. And other countries didn't have anything. And there was a feeling by the states who didn't have any land that those states who possessed land to the east or the west, of the Appalachian Mountains should give that land up for the benefit of all the states. And ultimately, when that decision is made and that land is ceded to the United States, the document is ratified. What is the Articles of Confederation? It's a firm league of friendship. They had bracelets and everything. It was fantastic. It's not a government you and I would recognize. Congress is the only branch of government, and that Congress is pretty weak. There is no executive, so no one to enforce the laws. There is no judicial branch, no one to interpret the laws. Every state, little tiny Rhode Island and little tiny Delaware and great big Virginia, they all had the same number of votes, one. If any laws were to be passed, it required 9 of the 13 states to agree, but even then, it was up to the states to enforce those laws. If any amendments were to be made to the articles, it would require unanimous consent, and so therefore, no amendments were ever made. Perhaps the most problematic issue is that this government lacks the power to tax. It makes sense. Again, are a people who were afraid of taxation, so it makes sense that they would not grant their own government the ability to tax, and yet that is one of the fundamental issues that a government must do in order to function. They can conduct foreign affairs, they can appoint army officers, but they can't maintain an army because, again, these are people who fear big government. What did King George do? He taxed us. What did King George do? He maintained an army in our borders. We're not going to grant that power to our own government. So if you need money, you ask the states, and they'll give it to you, perhaps. You need an army, you ask the states, and they'll raise one, perhaps. Overall, it's going to be a pretty bad government, but they do have one success, and that is with dealing with the Old Northwest, all that land that we talked about that was ceded. Let's take a look at it. The Old Northwest refers to the land north of the Ohio River, south of the Great Lakes, and east of the Mississippi. Essentially, it's Big Ten territory is what we're talking about. The Land Ordinance of 1785 divided up the land, surveyed it all, created townships that would then be sold off to pay down national debt, and it made sure that some of that land was set aside for the benefit of public education in the new territory, showing a rather far-sighted belief that education is going to be important in this new country. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 followed. It created a path for these new territories to be organized and eventually become states that would be treated equally with the other original 13 states. That in and of itself is pretty revolutionary, that you were going to create something new and provide it with equality with that which was old. But perhaps most importantly, it banned slavery in all of these new territories, meaning that as they grew as free states. And this, of course, down the road would be problematic. So maybe that's good, but other than that, The moment is indeed important. If government shrinks or is unable to enforce its laws, fresh maneuvers will be displayed by the insurgents. Anarchy and confusion must prevail, and everything will be turned topsy turvy in that state, where it is not probable the mischiefs will terminate. Who said that, and what are they talking about? That was said by George Washington. What was he talking about? Shay's Rebellion. Shay's Rebellion is just one example, the most famous example of how chaotic this time was. In 1786, indebted farmers in western Massachusetts, many of them Revolutionary War veterans, are having a pretty miserable life. They're in debt, and their state is taxing them into oblivion. They can't pay their taxes, they can't pay their debts. If you can't pay your debts, your homes, your farms are foreclosed upon. If your home's foreclosed upon, you lose your property. That means a lot back then. Property meant to be a full citizen, property meant to be a voter, property meant all sorts of things. And so Daniel Shays, a veteran in his own right, leads a rebellion, an armed rebellion to shut down the courts until new elections could be held. Congress, of course, can do nothing to help put an end to this armed insurrection because there is no army. Eventually, Massachusetts is able to raise a militia and put this down. But what Shay's Rebellion did is it convinced many people that this weak, ineffective form of government had to change. That there could be armed rebellions and people advocating for radical change, and there was no hedge against that. And so many influential elite people, like George Washington himself, began to say, wow, maybe we should consider changing our government. The first meeting to discuss changing the relationship between the states actually took place at Annapolis. This convention, many states were invited. They got the party supplies out. They set all the table for all these guests, and only 5 states attended. And it was a pretty miserable failure. It was specifically there to address trade disputes between the states. But out of that convention comes a motion to get the Congress that existed at the time to call for a convention for, quote, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. And with that, in 1787, 55 delegates from 12 of the states, Rhode Island was not going to participate, elected, or rather their legislatures did, elected these delegates to go to Philadelphia, again, for the sole purpose of revising the Articles. George Washington is going to be there, is going to be the chairman of the convention. Ben Franklin, the founding grandfather, is there. James Madison, Little Jimmy, that's him right there. The father of the Constitution is going to be there. And a young, brilliant man by the name of Alexander Hamilton, who is going to be the advocate for strong government, is going to be there. Many of the revolutionary leaders that we talk about, John Adams, Sam Adams, Thomas Jefferson, these folks are not there. Some of them are in Europe, for Adams and Jefferson, for example. Others were not elected. So while there are a few of the revolutionary leaders there, there's this new group of men who are there not to start a revolution, not to rebel against a king. They're there to create the framework for a new Republican form of government.